The courtroom was packed that morning, not because of a high-profile case, but because people had heard about Judge Ellison. They came to watch her tear people down, to see someone else humiliated before lunch. A tall black man in a modest gray suit stood at the defendant's podium. His hands were folded calmly in front of him, and a thin stack of papers sat untouched beside him. His name was Elijah Brooks, and he'd barely said a word since entering the room. Judge Margot Ellison leaned forward with a slight smirk. Her robe draped over her chair like armor. "Mr. Brooks," she said, each syllable dripping with condescension, "you've had more than enough time to speak, and quite frankly, I've heard enough of your educated nonsense." Her voice echoed. A few people in the gallery chuckled. A bailiff even cracked a grin. "You people," she continued, "always think you're smarter than the system. Let me remind you, you're not." That phrase hung in the air like smoke. Elijah didn't react. No flinch, no visible anger. He just lowered his gaze and offered the faintest smile. That smile wasn't defiance. It wasn't surrender. It was a clock ticking. Because in 11 minutes, everything in that room, every smirk, every whisper, every bit of silent cruelty, would be turned inside out. But no one saw it coming. Not the gallery who came for entertainment. Not the prosecutor who hadn't bothered reviewing Elijah's file. And certainly not Judge Ellison, who in that very moment sealed the fate of her own career. All because she mistook dignity for weakness. Before we continue, let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country or city below. We love seeing how far these stories reach. If this moment has already hit your heart or sparked your anger, smash that like button right now. And if you believe in truth, justice, and seeing the powerful held accountable, subscribe to the channel, because what's about to unfold is unlike anything this courtroom has ever witnessed. They thought he was just another case number, a man with a quiet voice, and no one in the gallery there to support him. No expensive lawyer beside him. No loud family shouting for justice. To them, Elijah Brooks was invisible. But that's exactly how he needed to be. From the moment he stepped into that courtroom, he knew what they saw. A soft-spoken black man in a plain suit. No tie, no attitude, just humility. And in a courtroom like Judge Ellison's, humility was mistaken for guilt. He didn't argue when the officer claimed he became aggressive at the library. He didn't interrupt when the prosecutor misquoted the event. He didn't flinch when the gallery rolled their eyes or exchanged smirks. Elijah had spent his life watching people judge before listening. But what none of them knew, not even the defense attorney who barely made eye contact, was that Elijah had once stood in that same courtroom, not as a defendant, but as a guest of honor. 10 years ago, Elijah Brooks had been recognized by the state for his work with the Federal Civil Rights Division, an undercover investigator who exposed abuse of power in public systems. Before that, he was a Harvard Law graduate with distinction. And before that, just a boy who learned how powerful silence could be in a world that talked too loud. Now, he chose silence again, not out of fear, but strategy, because sometimes letting people underestimate you is the fastest way to let them expose themselves. His real crime: asking a librarian why a group of white teens were allowed to loiter undisturbed while he was questioned the minute he stepped inside. A conversation, a camera, and a confrontation he didn't start. But once the officers arrived, the narrative was already decided. The courtroom didn't care about truth. It cared about patterns. Patterns Judge Ellison had followed her entire career. Elijah had read about her years ago. A judge with a perfect conviction rate when it came to low-income defendants of color, a woman praised for her efficiency and no-nonsense discipline. He hadn't come to fight her. He'd come to expose her, but not with shouts, not with rage, with precision. Because if she thought today was just another day, she was about to learn exactly who Elijah Brooks was. Judge Margot Ellison didn't need to raise her voice to control a courtroom. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She simply tilted her chin, pursed her lips, and reminded everyone that their place was beneath her. Her authority wasn't questioned. It was built into the walls, into the gavel, into every cautious whisper from attorneys who'd learned it was safer to agree than to challenge. Her courtroom ran on obedience, not justice. And over the years, she perfected a method, subtle, efficient, devastating. She interrupted defendants of color mid-sentence, claiming they were being argumentative. She disregarded eyewitness statements if the witness seemed emotional. She called it discipline. Her colleagues called it tough but fair. But the people who sat before her knew better. They remembered how she ignored a teenage girl's plea for a translator and proceeded with sentencing anyway. They remembered the public defender who requested more time to prepare and was fined for wasting the court's resources. They remembered the way her words weren't just rulings, they were weapons, and they cut deep. Some spoke up. Others tried to appeal. None of them won. Because the truth is, Judge Ellison never left evidence. No open slurs, no paperwork errors, just cold decisions made with quiet precision. Enough to change lives, but never enough to leave a stain on her record. And yet, the court staff noticed. The clerks who passed her files began to notice patterns, certain names, certain accents, certain faces that never seemed to get the benefit of the doubt. Bailiffs traded glances after rulings that felt too sharp, too fast. But they all stayed silent, because in her courtroom, fear sat in the front row. And that fear became habit, until the day Elijah Brooks walked in. Not loud, not angry, just observant. And she made her usual move. She cut him off, mocked him publicly, dismissed his quiet defense with that same cold smile. She thought it was business as usual. But for the first time in years, someone was counting. And soon, the entire courtroom would realize they hadn't been watching another trial. They'd been witnessing the beginning of a reckoning. That night, the courthouse emptied as if nothing had happened. No headlines, no protests, no mention of what the judge said. Just another man humiliated in court. But Elijah didn't go home defeated. He walked back through the same library where it all began, passing the same officers who hadn't apologized, the same patrons who looked away. He paused by a row of donated books, gently straightened a crooked spine on a shelf, then stepped into the reading room, where a group of children waited. "Sorry, I'm late," he said, his voice calm, steady. "Let's pick up where we left off." No one in that courtroom knew he still ran this community literacy program, that he returned here every week, not for recognition, but because knowledge was how he fought back. Later that evening, when the kids had gone and the lights dimmed, Elijah sat alone in the corner of the room. He opened an old leather case. Inside were files sealed in plastic, newspaper clippings, court transcripts, voice memos, and beneath it all, his old federal ID, Elijah Brooks, U.S. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. He hadn't used it in years. Not since he quietly stepped away from federal service after exposing a corrupt judge in another state. A judge who, like Ellison, wore arrogance like a robe. He hadn't stopped because he was tired. He stopped because he realized something. We keep targeting systems from the top he once told a colleague, but the real rot is in the routines, the courtrooms no one watches. That's why he returned, not as a lawyer, not as an agent, but as a defendant, because there's a different kind of power in being underestimated. He pulled out a flash drive, labeled in pen, Ellison, Pattern of Conduct. Inside was everything: audio clips, documented rulings, data points across years, cases just like his, people with no voice, people whose pain had been dismissed as procedure. He'd been watching her for 6 months, sitting in the back of her courtroom, filing quiet FOIA requests, talking to former defendants, building a record. And now she'd handed him her final piece. That line, "You people always think you're smarter than the system." She thought it was just another insult. She didn't realize it was evidence. Elijah sat back, the glow from his laptop lighting his face in the darkened room. Tomorrow, he wouldn't speak loudly, he wouldn't yell, but what he would do would echo far beyond her gavel. The next morning, the courtroom looked exactly the same. Same walls, same tired clock, same judge with her usual cold detachment flipping through papers as though she owned time itself. But today, something had shifted, subtly, quietly. Elijah Brooks walked in, wearing the same gray suit, the same calm expression. To the room, he was still invisible. That was exactly what he wanted. He didn't look at Judge Ellison, didn't meet the prosecutor's glance. He simply took his seat and placed a sealed envelope on the table in front of him. It sat there like a whisper in a room full of shouting. Inside was a legal motion, filed under federal law. It wasn't loud. It didn't accuse her directly. It simply asked for a judicial review based on patterned misconduct, obstruction of due process, and racially charged prejudicial behavior. It referenced case numbers, specific dates, language used in the courtroom, hers. Attached were transcripts, statements, and an anonymous affidavit from a former clerk who once resigned under pressure. It was airtight. The motion was quietly handed to the clerk before the judge entered. She glanced at the heading, blinked twice, and hurried it to the presiding office upstairs without saying a word. Elijah remained still, as if nothing had happened. Judge Ellison entered moments later, late by 5 minutes, unusual for her. She seemed flustered, tapping her pen against the bench while glancing toward the clerk's station, where a quiet buzz had started. She didn't know yet, but something in her gut shifted. "Let's proceed," she said sharply. As the case resumed, a tall man in a dark blue suit entered from the side door. No announcement, no noise. He took a seat quietly in the back row, opened a slim notepad, and began writing. Few noticed, but Elijah did. It was Deputy Director Raymond Torres, a senior officer from the Department of Justice. The same man who had once trained him. The same man who only showed up when something serious was about to break. And just like that, this wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a trap she had built for herself, and today the hinges began to loosen. Judge Ellison tried to resume her rhythm, interrogating a new witness, correcting the defense, rolling her eyes when objections were raised. But her glances kept flicking toward the back. The clerk, who usually smiled now, looked pale. The prosecutor, who once swaggered, now shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Something was happening, but the judge couldn't name it yet. And Elijah? He simply folded his hands and waited, because the first shot had been fired, and the courtroom hadn't even heard it. Courtrooms are built on silence, but not all silence is the same. There's the respectful kind, the fearful kind, the kind that Judge Ellison demanded from everyone who stood in front of her. But today, the silence felt different. It felt alert. As the hearing dragged on, murmurs started to ripple behind the scenes. A bailiff stepped out and didn't return. A junior clerk came back from upstairs whispering to another, their faces tight. A paralegal leaned toward the prosecutor and passed a note, their eyes darting nervously to the back of the room, toward the man in the dark blue suit still calmly scribbling in his notepad. Judge Ellison noticed every shift, but said nothing. She tapped her pen harder, forced her voice louder. She still thought she had the gavel, but control is a fragile thing. It doesn't break with noise. It fades quietly. And that's exactly what was happening. Outside in the hall, two attorneys stood whispering in front of the water cooler. "Did you hear?" one muttered. Filing under Title 42 named the judge directly. With audio, what audio? From inside her courtroom. The other's eyes widened. He recorded her. Dozens of people did, over months. It's not just one case. It's a record. Inside the courtroom, Elijah Brooks sat perfectly still. His hands never moved. His posture never shifted. But his presence had changed. People started noticing him differently, not as a man on trial, but as someone who already knew how this story would end. The judge kept going, rushing through witness statements, over-explaining her decisions as if she could outrun whatever shadow was growing behind her. The prosecutor fumbled his notes. The clerk hesitated before handing her the next file. Even the jury, though instructed to remain neutral, sat unusually stiff. Some kept looking toward Elijah as if they were finally wondering, who is this man? And still, no one said a word, because what was happening wasn't loud. It was unraveling, slowly, beautifully, strategically. Elijah's voice hadn't been raised once, but his silence had become the loudest thing in the room. And for Judge Margot Ellison, the walls of her courtroom, walls she had controlled with just a glance for over 20 years, were starting to feel tighter, more brittle. She hadn't lost yet. But deep in her chest, for the first time in her career, she felt it, the weight of truth. And it was heavy. Elijah stood. It wasn't a loud movement, no drama, no aggression, just a slow rise. The kind that makes people look up without knowing why. "Your Honor," he said, voice even and quiet, "I'd like permission to submit a piece of evidence." Judge Ellison squinted over her glasses, clearly annoyed. "You're not counsel, Mr. Brooks. You're the defendant." "I'm aware," Elijah replied gently. "But under Rule 104B, I have the right to challenge the credibility of the process if I believe bias has interfered with judicial fairness." Her face tightened. She knew that code, and she didn't expect him to. A low murmur fluttered through the room. Deputy Director Raymond Torres, still seated in the back row, leaned forward slightly. "I'll allow it," Ellison muttered, hoping to stay in control. Briefly, Elijah nodded. From his pocket he withdrew a slim black flash drive and handed it to the bailiff, who hesitated. The moment his fingers touched the drive, he sensed something. A shift. A weight. The courtroom screen flickered on. Elijah didn't turn to look. He'd already heard it 100 times. The footage began, grainy, from a spectator's phone. Not from today, but from another hearing months ago. The voice was unmistakable. Judge Ellison's voice. "You people come in here thinking your sob stories matter," she barked from the screen. "I don't have time to babysit your generational trauma." Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Another clip. "Don't waste my courtroom's time. If you can't speak without crying, maybe you shouldn't have broken the law." A woman in the gallery dropped her phone. The judge on the screen showed no restraint, no neutrality, just bitterness sharpened into policy. Clip after clip, not yelling, but slicing, and always. Directed at the same kinds of defendants, Elijah's face remained neutral. Judge Ellison's complexion, however, was draining by the second. The screen went black. Not respectful. Not still. And in that silence, Elijah turned slowly toward the judge. "These were your words, Your Honor, in this courtroom, over the last 3 years." The gallery didn't breathe. The clerk didn't move. Ellison tried to speak, but her mouth opened with no sound. Deputy Director Torres finally stood. "We've seen enough." His voice cut clean through the air. "Effective immediately. This court is under federal judicial review. All further hearings are paused. The motion submitted has triggered an emergency ethics inquiry." Elijah didn't blink. Ellison collapsed into her seat, her gavel clattering to the floor like a dropped mask. For the first time in her courtroom, she couldn't speak, because truth had taken the floor, and it wasn't leaving. Judge Ellison sat frozen. Her once rigid posture now slumped in disbelief as the echo of her own voice still lingered in the air. Her courtroom, the space she had commanded with iron certainty, felt unfamiliar now, smaller, louder. The gavel she dropped had rolled off the bench and lay near her feet, unnoticed. The crowd, still hushed, began to shift. One woman in the gallery shook her head slowly. A defense attorney in the back whispered, "It's finally happening." For the first time, the people who once feared her pitied her. Deputy Director Torres stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the floor with the sound of finality. "Judge Ellison," he said, "as of this moment, your authority over this courtroom is suspended. An independent review board will take over your docket. You are not to issue further rulings until the investigation is complete." She opened her mouth to speak, maybe to defend, maybe to deny, but no sound came. Because how do you defend what the world just heard in your own voice? Elijah remained still. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply watched as a system, so used to protecting itself, was finally forced to stare at its own reflection. The bailiff, who had once smirked at the judge's insults, now stood stiffly at her side, unsure of whether to help or distance himself. The prosecutor, once so certain of the case against Elijah, quietly closed his folder and slid it to the edge of the table. The courtroom was changing in real time, not because someone shouted louder, but because someone made truth undeniable. Ellison finally spoke, her voice low and brittle. "You planned this." Elijah met her eyes, calm, clear. "No," he said, "you did." And that sentence struck harder than any accusation ever could. She had built this courtroom into her kingdom. But brick by brick, word by word, she had also laid the foundation for its collapse. As she sat there, robe draped around her like a faded symbol, it became painfully clear. The authority she'd wielded for decades wasn't real. It was borrowed, and now it had been revoked. Elijah turned, walking past the jury box, past the stunned lawyers, past the deputy director. He paused only once beside the bench, where the gavel still lay on the floor. He didn't pick it up. He didn't need to, because today justice didn't need a symbol. It had already spoken. And for once, everyone listened. The courtroom remained still, no gavel, no orders, no judge presiding. And yet every eye turned to Elijah Brooks, not as a defendant, but as something else, something freer, bigger. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand behind a podium. He simply turned to face the room, slowly, deliberately, and let the silence settle. Then he spoke. "I didn't come here today to win." His voice was soft, but it carried like thunder in the stillness. "I came here to be seen, the way so many before me were never allowed to be." People leaned forward. Not just the jury, not just the reporters. Even the bailiff listened now with different eyes. For years, this courtroom was a stage, Elijah continued. A place where stories were rewritten, where tears were labeled manipulation, where anger was aggression, where dignity was confused for defiance. He glanced over to the gallery, to the woman whose son sat here last year, to the man fined for asking a question, to the teenager told his accent made him suspicious. I didn't forget you. The system hoped we all would. Whispers broke out, soft gasps from those who remembered those cases, the ones swept under rugs, the ones with no headlines. Elijah paused, his gaze calm but burning. You see, justice isn't something you're handed. It's something you reclaim, inch by inch, word by word, until even the silence can't protect those who abuse it. He turned his head, just slightly, toward the bench where Judge Ellison now sat, small and silent in her own courtroom. And sometimes, he added, the only way to make the system listen is to let it collapse under the weight of its own echo. A beat. No one breathed. Then quietly, someone in the gallery began to clap. Not loud, just enough to break the stillness. Another followed, and another, until the courtroom, once filled with fear and control, was filled with something else, recognition. Not applause for a victory, but for a voice that had finally broken through. Elijah didn't smile. He didn't bow. He simply nodded once and walked out. Not as a man who beat the system, but as the man who revealed it. The courthouse steps were quieter than anyone expected. No outrage, no shouting, just the soft, patient hum of cameras blinking in place, recording everything as if they already knew the world was about to change. Elijah Brooks stepped out into the cold morning air. The sun cut through the clouds for the first time that day, casting long shadows across the stone stairs. He stood still, not in triumph, but in reflection. Behind him, the heavy doors creaked shut, sealing off a courtroom that would never be the same again. He didn't walk down immediately. He looked out at the crowd, faces of every age and shade. Some were silent. Some held signs. Some simply held their breath. There were no officials to greet him, no victory banners, just people. A woman near the front clutched a sign that read, "We remember the silenced." A high school student live-streamed quietly. A young father whispered to his little boy, pointing at Elijah with the reverence one might reserve for a monument. Nathaniel Vaughn stepped beside him, calm and steady. "You changed something today," he said under his breath. Elijah's eyes didn't leave the horizon. "I didn't change anything," he replied. "They did." And he was right. Because what started in that courtroom wasn't about one ruling. It wasn't about embarrassing a judge or flipping a verdict. It was about revealing something the system tried so long to bury. Not through noise, but through evidence, through calm, through truth. Somewhere inside that building, Judge Ellison's nameplate was being taken down from her door. No ceremony, no dignity, just closure. Her courtroom was no longer hers. And that silence, that was the sound of justice finally walking in. Weeks passed. Elijah didn't chase interviews or bask in praise. Instead, he sat quietly at a local college auditorium during a panel on courtroom accountability. He wasn't speaking. He was listening. Young lawyers, survivors of wrongful arrests, former public defenders, all stood up and spoke with something new in their voices. Belief. A belief that their stories could matter. A belief that truth, when held long enough, could still rise. On the internet, clips from his trial flooded timelines. Hashtags bloomed. Elijah spoke was more than a trend. It was a message. 2 more judges were quietly placed under investigation. Law professors rewrote their ethics lectures to include his hearing. It had begun. Not a rebellion made of flames, but of light. At home one night, Elijah stood before the mirror. No uniform, no chains, no labels, just a man who had once been reduced to a file number, now remembered for his voice. He didn't see a hero. He saw a responsibility, a fire still burning, because for every person who watched him walk free, there were still hundreds stuck in the silence he once knew so well. And to them, he made a quiet promise. They will remember this one. And before you go, tell us, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Your voice matters. Every city, every country, every name. We read them all. And if this story stirred something inside you, if Elijah's journey reminded you of your own silence, then click the like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this story. Because truth only wins when people carry it forward. Now, let's talk. If you were Elijah Brooks, what would you have said? What would you do if the system tried to silence you? Drop your answer in the comments below. Let's flood this space with voices the world can't ignore. This isn't just the end of a story. It's the beginning of a movement.